Hey everyone, this is John Dickinson from Motionworks.net, back with an After Effects tutorial for you. This is actually a more detailed walkthrough of the presentation I gave at C-Connect, the creative conference in Malaysia and Singapore last week. And for those of you who attended the conference, thanks for being there. It was an excellent event. This will give you a little more depth to what I presented on stage. It's also going to be a refresher, of course, but because I have a little bit more time, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. And for those of you who didn't attend the conference, well, you can see what it was all about. So let's dive straight in and take a look at the finished animation, and then we're going to walk through and break it down.
Hooray! Hooray!
So the title for my session obviously was After Effects Like a Boss. And I designed this title and animation to showcase a bunch of different tips and techniques in After Effects, and also a few really good third-party scripts that I use that save time. Just out of interest, the sound effects that I added in Adobe Audition come from the Motion Sound Volume 1 library, and you can check that out on Gumroad. It's a really good library of sound effects for motion design artists. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of things going on here. I've got the stroke drawing on and shaping into the arm, which flexes. Got these boss letters falling down quite naturally and sort of jostling each other into position. After and effects sliding in and squashing, and the word like is bouncing in quite naturally. And then the text is shaking and filling up with liquid. So let's break this down. So I'm going to press the tab key and just the right arrow key to come into the arm comp. Okay, so the arm is created using shape layer paths, and you can see I've got a guide layer here, and this is a slightly more detailed arm, but it gave me a good guide for which to follow to create something more simplified. Now you can see under the shape layer, under contents, I have arm 1, arm 2 and arm 3. I've just renamed these groups. Under each one is a shape, and it has its own transform properties. Now I've broken the arm down into 3 parts because it makes it much easier to animate. To each of these I've added the trim paths operator. Add trim paths. And this also allowed me to use one for each of these groups, which allowed me to keyframe them individually. So that just gave me a little bit more flexibility. So I could adjust the timing of when the strokes happened. If they used one trim path for all 3 of these groups, then all of these strokes would have come on at the same time, and I wanted to have them come individually. So it just flowed on more naturally. The timing just seemed to work a lot better that way. So let's just create a quick path, and you can see exactly how I did it. So with arm selected, I'm going to grab the pen tool and just zoom in a little bit. Now I have Roto Bezier activated. So I'll just click and click and click. And because I had arm selected, it's just going to add a new group here. You can see it's called Shape 1. I'll just rename this Test. Now I want to see the path parameter, so I'm going to type in path. Much easier to use the search box here to find things. And I'm going to set a keyframe. Now, all of the vertices are selected, so I'm going to hold down Alt or Option on the Mac and just drag a marquee around that one to select it. Also, with Alt held down, I can click and I get a double-sided arrow, drag to the left and I have a sharp corner, drag to the right and I have zero tension, which gives me a nice rounded corner. Nice little handy tip there. So I'll leave that like that. And just bring this down like that. Move in time, and then just bring it up like that. Okay, I want that to draw on, so I'm going to use trim paths. So with that selected, I'm going to click Add Trim Paths. And just keep in mind what you have selected in your shape layer hierarchy will dictate where these things are added. So just be careful what you've got selected. because I know I had the test group selected, then that's drop trim paths down here. So here I'm going to change the end value, bring it back to 0, create a keyframe, and just have that finish a little sooner, just to there. Drawing on and flexing up. Now the cap is set to a butt cap at the moment. I want it rounded. So I'm just going to twirl contents back up and down again. I just want to see my stroke. That's the one I want. You can see it's set to butt cap. I'm going to change that to round cap. And that's as simple as that. It was very, very easy to do just by animating shape layers. I thought about creating something then using the puppet pin tool, but this was way more flexible for the kind of style that I wanted. I'm going to delete that test. One other thing I want to mention here, if I just type in the word color, notice, if I just maximize this, notice that I have 3 different colors, or 3 of the same color, but for arm 3 and arm 2, I've just used the expression pick whip and I've just linked them up to color 1. That just means if I need to change the color of the stroke, then I only have to change it in one place. But I've gone one step further and I've dragged that color up to the Essential Graphics panel for my main composition. You can see here I actually have the main comp selected, and I've actually created a group and I've named it arm, and I've taken arm 1 color because the other 2 are linked to that, and just dragged it and dropped it in here. If I do it again, it'll tell me it's already in there. So now when I'm working in my main comp and I decide to, or someone asks me to change the color of the stroke, I can quickly just click that, change the color, and all 3 of those strokes will update. A really nice time saver. I really suggest you create these kind of simple relationships between layers as you're working, because it saves a lot of time later. It's not the kind of thing that you'll jump back in when you finish the project and then set up. You should do it as you go. Only takes a couple of seconds and can save time later. I've done the same for stroke width. So just linking stroke width up to the arm 1 stroke width, and then dropping that into the Essential Graphics panel. Now, generally in the Essential Graphics panel, you can right click and you can change the range of values. Some of the sliders you can't. And if I was to grab the slider here and change it, you can see I get this massive stroke. It's already gone up to 490. I can't change the range. So in this case, I need to do it manually. Let's make it 5. So just be mindful of that. Change it back to 10. Okay, so that's the arm. Let's take a look at the text. So we'll start off by looking at the boss text. I'm just going to solo that. So you can see there's a lot of keyframes in there. The good news is that this wasn't keyframed manually. I actually used the new Physics Now script for this, and then I made some adjustments to it. So let's just quickly jump into this composition, and we can just set something up and I can show you how useful Physics Now actually is. So Physics Now is a new script for adding some dynamics to your After Effects projects. And what I really like about it is that it's integrated into your normal After Effects workflow. Let me show you what I mean. So I've got the boss text here, just sitting out of the frame, and I've got a solid layer, which is going to act as the floor. I've got some rotation keyframes, just going to drag those out for now. So with boss selected, I'm going to click on this button here and make this a dynamic layer. And when I do that, you'll see the effect control panel open, and it's adding some effects for the new dynamic boss layer. It's also created a shape layer that's a guide layer for physics world control, and it's added some world controls, things like gravity. Now if I select the floor, I'm going to make that a static layer, and that gets its own settings as well. And if I click on the simulate button now, you can see Physics Now has changed my text, kept the original version and turned it off, and created shape layers for each of the individual letters. And they're bouncing down, looking quite dynamic. Very nice. And this is all expressions based. Now, if I want to make any changes, for example, change the gravity, I'm just going to increase that to 20 and just re-simulate. So every time you make a change, you need to just click the simulate button again. You can see it's pretty responsive. If I want to change the floor, let's just drag these rotation keyframes up so the floor rotates and simulate again. And nice, the B gets flicked up and it recognizes that the other letters are dynamic, so it just slides across the top like a conveyor belt. Very nice. That would be so fiddly to do manually. Now, once you have an animation you like, but you know you need to make adjustments to it, or you want to fine-tune it, then you can click on the button next to simulate, which is simulate to keyframes. And this will bake your animation, and it'll be identical to the animation that I created using the simulate button, which is really nice too. Those of you who've used dynamics in Cinema 4D can know how difficult it can be to control. You might simulate and get it looking right, and then try it again and it looks slightly different. But I haven't found that to be the case with these simulations. So with that done, if I select it, select those layers, you can see there's all my motion paths and keyframes. Just hit U and there's all my keyframes. Very nice. If you want to remove the effects from the layers, just click this button here. If you want to take everything back to the way it was, just click the X and your composition is untouched. So as I mentioned, it's nicely integrated and it doesn't leave a big footprint if you decide you want to go back to where you were. And you can check out physics now on Crunchy Creative's website. It's very good value. And there's a few tutorials and things you can watch there. So terrific time saver. Let's go back into the text composition and take a look at some further adjustments I made to my boss text. So with those selected, just press U. You can see there's all my baked keyframes. Now in my case, the B actually came down and literally landed pretty much in exactly the right position. So I didn't have to do anything to the B. But the other letters ended up being a little bit too far to the right. And obviously for my logo, it needed to be exactly the way the text was when I typed it in. So when I was doing this, I had to think of a way for the O, the S, and the S to move back into their original positions. And I didn't want to do that without some other object in the logo causing that, because there's no sense in having it looking really nice and dynamic, and then for no reason, these letters just move by themselves. I could have actually kept simulating until they kind of landed in the right position and then just done a couple of minor adjustments. But in my case, I realized that the arm animation was going to be the perfect vehicle for getting those letters back to their positions and making it seem like it was actually designed that way. So when the letters come down, they jostle nicely, stop about here, and they rest. But what I've done is I've removed all the keyframes and added my own position and rotation keyframe so that when the arm opens up, they rock to the right. So it feels like they're in the same scene as the arm, and they're reacting to the arm movement, which is nice. And then when the arm flexes again, that pushes them back into position. So it was a really nice solution for how to get those letters back into place. So even though I didn't design originally, or didn't have an idea of how the letters were going to get into place, as I was working, that solution became evident. So that's the boss letters. Just select all of those and deselect. Let's take a look at after and effects. Now these words slide in from the left. You can see effects comes in. It's quite stretched. And then it hits. We just turn the arm back on. So it hits the stroke and squashes and then sort of rotates back into place. And then after comes in, hits it, and then slides back into position. So let's take a look at how that was animated. Once again, I could have done this manually, but I've saved a bit of time using the terrific Squash and Stretch Pro, which you can get from aescripts.com. So with the word selected, if I come over here to the panel and click on Select a Behavior, it'll open up a little library window and it'll give me some previews of the different kinds of animations. Now the one I want, click again, the one I want or the one I used was Move In. It's pretty simple. So I select that, and over here in the panel, just come down. There's a few settings that I can set. Things like squash and stretch and oomph. I also need to set my end of behavior time. So I'm just going to put that there and click on Apply. That applies the Bezier warp effect, and you can see everything's been keyframed there. If I hit U, you can see there's also anchor point, position, and scale keyframes. Just preview that. Make sure I have my work area set correctly. So it's going to slide in and stretch and look pretty good. Now, I use this as a base, so I didn't need the Bezier warp effect, so I just deleted that. So that was pretty much the base that I had. Remember in my text composition how my effects text squashes when it hits. So in order to do that, I have to move the anchor point to the right side of the text. Now, of course, if I grab the pan behind tool, or the anchor point tool as it's known, and click and drag, watch what happens down here with the position keyframes. If I click and drag that to the front, of course, that adds a new position keyframe, which is not what I want. So here what I have to do is just open up the layer panel. Just bring this to the right here. Get my selection tool and click and drag and put that on the right. So you can manipulate the anchor point even with position keyframes active in your timeline, but you need to do it here in the layer panel. You can see it set a new anchor point keyframe. It was set to 2 hold keyframes at the beginning and the end, but none of them actually do anything, so I can actually just turn that off. Okay, so when it hits, just going to make sure this is on a whole keyframe, or on a whole frame. When it hits, I need it to squash. Comes in and boom. So here I'm going to just squish that down like that. Slides in, and obviously at the moment it's actually squashing before it hits, which is not what I want. So if I right click, I can choose toggle hold keyframe, or if I hold down Control Alt or Command Option on Mac and click on scale, this is the keyframe before the one we just set. That'll toggle that hold keyframe. Now it's going to hold that squash, or it's going to hold that stretch value until it hits, just like that. Okay. Now I want it to unsquash fairly quickly because at the moment it's just unsquashing really slowly. So I'm going to bring that keyframe back in. Let's just preview this. Just set my work area. Okay, so that's actually looking all right. Maybe it could unsquash a little bit sooner. Nice. So now I want to add a bit of rotation. Now, of course, layers rotate around their anchor point too, which is good for this because I've already moved the anchor point. So if I press Shift R to add the rotation parameter into here, I'm going to click to make a keyframe. I want that to happen on impact. So I'll put the first one there, move a few frames. I'm going to use the plus key on my keypad just to rotate that up a little bit, maybe to there. Control right arrow to have that come down back to 0 pretty quickly. Let's preview that. Okay, that's not bad. Maybe make it come up a little bit higher. Plus. And then we might just bring this one forward a bit and just a little extra bounce at the end. So I'll have it come up by 1 degree. Move forward and then have it come to 0. That's nice. Maybe a little bit too subtle. Maybe make this 2. There we go. Yeah, that's looking good. So see how I use Squash and Stretch Pro to give me the basic animation, which saved me time, but then I can easily go in and fine tune the keyframes to get the look that I like. So we'll go back to the text comp. I just pressed Shift Escape to take me back to the previous composition. And I'm just going to reset to my saved layout. You can see I've only got one workspace set up in here. I've actually gone in and I've do not show. I've set to do not show all the other workspaces, and I've just kept mine. You know what it's like in After Effects. You're shifting windows around and things, become a little bit untidy. And then every time you do something, you move the window around again. I find it's really easy to set the workspaces exactly how I like them, and then just come up here and right click and just reset them occasionally. Okay, so back here, let's take a look at After. So I set up the animation for effects, and then I duplicated that and replaced it with the word After. And I've just changed where that anchor point, changed the position of the text so that they actually look like they're impacting on the other objects. Effects hits arm, and After hits effects. But After slides back a little bit further. Look at the keyframes. After impact, I've changed the position keyframes a little bit more so it slides back into place. And just ease that in. And then to get it back to where it needs to be, I've just, as I mentioned, had that kind of invisible thread where it's being pulled back somewhat grudgingly into position. And you can see it's got that kind of jerky look where it looks like the bottom of the R is catching against some sort of invisible floor. And as it does that, it just squashes slightly and then gets pulled and then drops. Let's just preview this. Just like that. And the reason that looks good is because I've set those to hold keyframes. Let me just change those back to Bezier keyframes. Now I didn't have these intermediate keyframes at all. I just had it like this. And it just slides back. It's still got the scale keyframes, which actually makes it look quite nice. But it looks a lot better when it has those hold position keyframes. And what I did was move in time a bit, then move the object manually, then set a keyframe. So it's kind of posterized the time of that. If I just set the first and last keyframe to hold, it basically would hold the movement and then it would jump to this position. But I've broken it down so that between this point and this point, it jumps to the next position when those keyframes are set to hold keyframes. Just like that. Just gives it a little more character. And then it drops down and has a little bump at the end, just like the other one. You can see here, it just bumps up and down. Boop. It was only 1 degree. Okay, so that's how After and effects were animated. Now I actually added some speed lines behind the text. To do that, I used the speed line script, which is available from AE Scripts. Just turn that on. You can see there's the speed lines. Just going to whip into the speed lines composition. I'll just quickly show you how those were created. Literally just select the text. I've got it sliding in here. And just with speed lines active, I actually was able to get the panel up from the window menu because I have it installed. It's just out of the viewable area here, speed lines. All I have to do with the layer selected is set my initial settings the way I want them and click Create Speed Lines, just like that. And in it comes. If I want to make some changes, it's actually added. If we just open up the Effect Control panel with that selected, it's added some settings in here. I can change the length, I can change the offset, like that. If I want to adjust these, the height of these or the separation, I can come in here and change that. Maybe change it to 4 and less separation, and just click Update Speed Lines. And there we go. And this is just a shape layer with shape layer paths. So once again, using a script to create something that would take a little bit of time to do manually. And lastly, the word like is once again using a squash and stretch preset. And this has hardly been adjusted at all. I've just modified the last few keyframes to have it just jiggle backwards and forwards a little bit longer than it was with the preset. Just bounces into position. You can see it actually down here on the left, it actually rotates. It spins, whoop, and then comes in and bounces in. But I didn't need the spin, so I just wanted to jump into the frame, just like that. Okay, so that's the actual text animation. As far as the color goes, just use an adjustment layer. And you can see I've added the fill effect. And once again, I've taken that fill effect and I've dropped it into the essential graphics panel for the main composition. And you can see I've named that A like a boss. So that just means that I can once again change that from the main composition. It's changing the arm because that's turned on in this comp, but that's actually in a separate composition. So we just undo that and turn that off. Okay, so with all that in place, obviously that reads After Effects like boss. So I needed to think of a way to make it read like a boss, and that's how I come up with the idea of filling it up with a liquid. So let's take a look at that. Now, at the moment, I have another version of that, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But for now, what I'll do is, I'll talk about this in a moment. Just turn that one on. Okay, so you can see the layer rotates, the text rotates backwards and forwards, just jiggles like this. And you can see it fills up and has some bubbles as well. So what we'll do is we'll go into the bubbles comp, and I've got a breakdown composition here. If I just unhide it, there's all my original layers. That's just for presentation purposes. So I've broken down After Effects like a boss into two separate compositions. You can see this one has the After Effects masked out, and this one has the invert of that. Just keeps it nice and tidy and allows me to work with like a boss without affecting this other text. So to get the text to fill up, I've used a solid layer. I've named it liquid here. And you can see it has a mask applied. If I just turn that on, you can see it fills up like that. Now to that, I've applied a couple of effects. The first is fill, to make it orange. And I've dragged that fill effect once again across to the main composition's essential graphics panel. And I can change that from here at any time. Now, next I've applied the wave warp effect. Wave warp is available under the distort category. It's right out of the viewable area here, down the bottom, wave warp. And I've keyframed that. Just twirl this open. I've keyframed the height and the width so that the bubbles are the waves are a little bit smaller at the beginning, a little bit tighter, and then they're a little bit looser towards the top, like that. And I've also added the transform effect. Now, transform is another way of animating position, rotation, and scale, and it's great to use. I use it a lot when I want to change the render order of After Effects. But it also has a skew parameter. And I've used that skew parameter, just added some keyframes, to make it look as if the water's kind of sloshing from side to side. Because remember, in the previous comp, just have a look at the keyframes. You can see I've actually used Squash and Stretch Pro in here, and it's added some position and rotation keyframes. And that's what's allowed me to make it look like it's moving from side to side. And look how the water looks like it's sloshing from side to side. And I just eyeballed this. So it looks like the water just slushing from side to side. So they're the three effects that we use for the liquid, but of course I have to get that to play within the Like a Boss text, to be matted within that. Quick way to do that was to use Preserve Transparency. So as long as that's above the Like a Boss text, clicking on Preserve Transparency will have that only be revealed by the layers below, which is in this case is Like a Boss. If I was to put After Effects or After Effects underneath that, that would also be filled up with that liquid, which is not what I want. So you can see that's why I isolated it. So it fills up like that and now reads Like a Boss. To make it more interesting, I've added another solid layer above that, and it's just red at the moment, but I've used the bubbles effect, CC Bubbles, and I've keyframed the bubble speed. So it moves up a little bit faster. Now we need the bubbles to play within the text. So once again, activating Preserve Transparency. But we also need it to only be visible within the liquid as well. So to do that, I've used the Set Matte effect applied to the bubbles layer. And something to keep in mind here, you can see Take Matte from layer is set to liquid. So we're going to use the matte from this layer. But I need the CC Bubbles to recognize the wave warp as well. So for that, I've used the Input Layer option, Effects and Masks. If I deselect that, just choose Source, you can see the bubbles are playing within the liquid, but they're also visible above it as well. So I need to set that to Effects and Masks and turn the effect on. And now Set Matte is recognizing not only the mask, but also the other effects as well. So why would you use this? Literally to save yourself from pre-composing. Before input layer options were available in After Effects, I would have had to pre-compose this liquid layer in order to bake the masking and the effects into the layer itself. But with input layer options, I don't have to do that. And also I've filled that with an orange, slightly lighter orange than the liquid orange. Remember, I linked Like a Boss orange in the Essential Graphics panel. If I change that orange to say a green, notice how the bubbles also change color. That's because I've actually used an expression. Let me just type in color here. So I've linked the color of the bubbles using a fill effect to the color of the liquid. Just undo that. But I've multiplied the returned value by a number. So what this means is that when I change the Like a Boss text, the bubbles are also going to change color. So it's just another time-saving thing that you can set up in advance that are going to save you from having to change both later. Just keep that in mind. One thing I would like to do, just with bubbles, is just change one of the settings in here. Just set up, let's see, wobble amplitude. I'm going to set a keyframe for wobble amplitude. I think it'd be nice because the text is being shaken if the bubbles wobbled from side to side a bit more. So I'll leave that at 10, then I'll bring that up quite a lot. I'm not sure how much I need. So, and I want them to be wobbling quite a lot like that. And then they even out. And will depend on, if we just come back to the other comp, it'll depend on how much it's rotating. So let's just preview this. Just got to make sure I don't have the, just reveal this actually, reveal. I'm going to turn off my proxy. I just had proxies because it makes them easier to RAM preview. Okay, let's have a look at this. Oh, that's good. it just gives the bubbles a little bit more of a dynamic feel. I'll just try that again. Yeah. So they're moving a fair bit when the text is shaking a lot, and then when it starts to come to rest, they're moving a little bit, or they're wobbling a little bit less. I'm going to come back and just change that to an even higher value, and just have it stop wobbling. Shift escape. A little bit later. That's nice, isn't it? Okay, so a nice little adjustment there. Okay, so that's the bubbles like a boss reveal. One thing I will point out is that once the text finishes rotating, it doesn't come to a dead stop. It actually eases into position. That's because I've used the inertial bounce effect on position and rotation. Now, inertial bounce is just something you can Google. Just a really handy expression for making your animations look a little bit more natural. Let me just turn these off for a sec. So this is how it looked without that. It just comes to a dead stop, okay? But inertial bounce gives you a much more natural looking ease. Really important if you're going to make your animations look a little more realistic. Okay, so that was the main animation. When I was creating this animation, I thought, well, there's obviously probably 1,000 ways I could reveal like a boss. So I started to think of different ways to reveal like a boss. Let's take a look at a few that I created. And this is where I'll talk to you a little bit about this style option here in the Essential Graphics panel. All of my reveals are in the reveals composition, and I wanted to create a quick way to turn those on and off inside the Essential Graphics panel in the main composition. So I've used a simple expression under the opacity parameter. Let's just solo opacity. Now what I've done here, I've created a new null object and I've named it expression controls, and to that I've applied an expression checkbox. So that's an expression control effect. Checkbox, let's see if I can find it here. Checkbox control. So I've applied a checkbox control to my expression controls layer, and I've linked the opacity up to that just using the expression pick whip, and just added this little bit of extra coding at the end. And what this will do is will mean that when the expression checkbox is checked, we just come over to effect here, bubbles. Well, when it's on, you'll see the layer. When it's off, you won't see the layer. So it's just an on-off checkbox. And I've gone ahead and done that for all of these different variations. And now I've taken that checkbox and dragged it up into the Essential Graphics panel of the main composition. What would be really nice is if I turned one on, it turned the others off. But currently you have to actually turn one off and then turn the next one on. It's probably a bit of sneaky, tricky code that I could have used to change that, but I'm unaware of that just now. So let's take a look at this one. This is using Shatter. And just out of interest, Shatter was created 20 years ago this year. So 1999 by Brian Maffett. And unbelievably, it's still useful. Can you believe a plugin? 20 years old. So this time I've kept the same rotation animation, but as it's rotating, it's shaking off the front face over the veneer to reveal like a boss below. Let's go into that comp. I'm not going to break down Shatter. You can have a look online for loads of tutorials, but one thing I will show you is I've actually used shape layer, gradient shape layer, to control the shatter. And I think this is probably one of the most important features, is how to get the shatter to shatter where you want and when you want. So with that ramp, if I just select the layer with shatter, which is this one here, you can see under gradient, I've chosen for gradient layer, shadow ramp, and I've animated the shadow threshold. So these two are related. So by animating the shadow threshold, I can decide when I want the shadow to happen. If I want it to happen earlier, I can just change that value, and that'll start to shadow earlier. So two really important settings, gradient and shadow threshold. So probably the most important thing, I think, in shadow is the gradient and how you can use it to control when the shadow actually happens. Just like that. Now I've used a drop shadow as well. Let's go back in here. The drop shadow layer, you're only going to see because it has preserve transparency turned on. So I wanted the shadow to cast a shadow on the text, but only be visible on the text and not on the background. So to do that, I just use the preserve transparency checkbox. So it's just a duplicated layer, duplicated like a boss layer. And to drop shadow, I've just chosen to show shadow only, like that. So I separated the shadow from the text and just use preserve transparency. Now I did create a variation of the shadow. Let's just go into here, we'll turn this one on. So this is more like a sawdust kind of effect, like this. And once again, I've used the same technique, shadow ramp. But here I've used turbulent displace just to make it a little more organic, just to break it up a bit. Let's just take a look. I'll turn turbulent displace off. And you can see here, it's quite a straight gradient. But with turbulent displace turned on, just makes that look a little more organic. So you can use effects on your shadow ramp. Now I've probably come down to here and let's have a look at gradient. Yeah, you can see I've used effects and masks. And remember, that's because I have an effect applied to the shadow ramp layer and I haven't pre-composed. So I want the shadow to see the turbulent displace applied. And that's how that one looks. So shadow still has its uses. Not quite as sexy as some of the newer particle plugins, but still with a little bit of work, you can come up with some quite good transitions like this. Okay, the next one is drain. Let's just preview that one. So here I've had the O kind of suck the like a boss word into itself. And I've used a range of different effects here. I've used a transform effect, and I've used twirl and flow motion. So twirl is twirling it like it's going down a drain. And by the way, the reason I used transform was to scale it right down so it disappears. Looks a bit weird here, but I put that effect on after I'd actually added these effects because I needed it to disappear. And the reason I didn't use a transform property is because I needed to change the render order. And that's why I use transform rather than using the transform property. After that, I've used CC flow motion, and that's giving that sort of sucking. So you can see it's kind of sucked in and twirls in like that. And I've also used CC glass. Now the trick with this is I've used the like a boss orange text to control where the glass is actually happening. Let's just come up to CC glass. So it's using that as a bump map. You can see I've chosen like a boss. Once again, I've chosen effects and masks. If I don't choose that, if I just choose source, you can see it doesn't work with the middle of the O because I've actually used the minimax effect on the like a boss text. We'll look at that in a sec. So this is nice. It feels like the letters are being dragged like some kind of tablecloth, being sucked in. Didn't have to add it, but I thought it just added a bit more interest, just by using boss as a bump map. Also use the radial shadow effect rather than the drop shadow, because I can control how far the shadow is from the layer it's applied to around the edges. And I've just keyframed that on so that it's a little bit closer at the start and then it's a little bit further away from the text. Just adds a little depth to this. Now let's just talk about the Minimax effect. So I wanted this to look like it's being sucked, kind of like lips. So I've used the Minimax effect. Let me just turn off the mask. You can see I've keyframed the radius like that, and then had it come back down to 0. But I only wanted the Minimax effect to affect the O. So in this case, I've used a mask. Now, if you're not used to masks for effects, just show you. If I just click Add, and just come and type Comp, you can see I've chosen for Minimax mask 1. So the mask reference is mask 1. I just make that none. And that just now acts as a regular mask. But by choosing it as an effect mask, I'm now masking off the Minimax effect and isolating where that Minimax effect happens. So once again, like input layer options, it just stops me from having to pre-compose this layer, keep everything together, and make my composition or make my project less complicated. And as I mentioned for CC Glass, just choosing effects and masks so that that Minimax effect is recognized. So that was the drain look. Just like that. Would have been fun to do sound effects for all of these. Okay, so the next one is escape. This is just using the puppet pin tool. So I've had the letters run off. Just make this a bit bigger. I thought it'd be nice to have the boss letters run off and then the like text run off a little bit later, like it's being left behind. Just like that. So here I've used, as I mentioned, the puppet pin tool. Let's just see. Here we go. Got that selected. You can see the mesh here. So for this, what I did was pretty simple. I've just added 2 pins, one to the top of the letter, and one to the bottom. And I just put 2 keyframes for the bottom one. And I animated that first. So I just literally set a keyframe, drag that pin all the way out. If we just turn this one off, you can see it gets dragged out like that. So that gave me the position. And then I've actually animated the top of it, or the top pin, to follow along. But I've also just changed things like the stretch and the rotation of the text as well. You can see there's more keyframes for the top one than there is for the bottom one. And just added a little bit of anticipation at the beginning so that the text leans back and then bounces out like that. And you can see they're pretty much copy and paste. You can see the motion path there, like that. And I just used guides so that I knew how far apart the text needed to be spaced. You can see that first S comes to that point, then the next S, and then the O, and then the B. Otherwise, they move out at different speeds. I wanted them to move out all pretty similar speed. Once I had that animation set up, I duplicated that layer, and you can see how the S below moves in the same way for the first few frames. That's actually duplicated keyframes. Then I deleted all the other keyframes and had it bounce back into position, like it's being pulled but doesn't want to go, like that. So puppet pin tool, still very, very useful, and it's been updated in the latest version of After Effects with more features. I used all the original features for this. I didn't have to use any of the new features. And the result is pretty good. I thought the result of this was pretty nice. Just like that. Next one is Melt. This was a fun one where I explored the liquefy tool. Let's just make sure I'm in the right comp. This is the liquefy effect. So the text, once again, here is shaking, and it's kind of shaking the letters loose, and they're sort of melting off. And as they come off, you can see there's a drip that gets pulled off as well. Let's just take a quick look at how this was created. Okay. Got to turn off the proxy for this one. So I've got like a boss below. And let's just dig into here. I've used different applications of liquefy to make this look a little more interesting. You can see I've got liquefy 1, 2, 3, 4 times. It's a little bit slow, this effect, but this allowed me to get it look a little more like it was melting rather than applying liquefy just once. And you can see I've set keyframes for distortion percentage. So I've literally just used this smear option and just used the brush and just smeared it down and just animated the amount of distortion, or the percentage of distortion. You can see I've applied the CC glass effect to that. And once again, I've used like a boss as a bump map, but here I haven't had to use the input layer options because like a boss doesn't have any effects or masks applied. The shadow is just filled up with a darker orange. And you can see once again, I've also linked that to the original like a boss orange. And I've divided that by 2 to make it a little darker. And I've just delayed that a little bit by dragging it slightly forward in the timeline so that after the first text has melted off, we get this darker sort of shadow behind it. It wasn't really meant to be a shadow. It was more like the letters were a little bit damp and the liquid was leaving some moisture in these letters. You know what I mean? Almost like, I guess not moisture, almost like a slug or a snail would leave a trail. I just thought that extra level of detail made it look a little more interesting, like that. So that was the base. Inside of here, I've used a shape layer to create the drip. Let's just zoom out here. You can see with all of those liquefy effects applied, it's actually quite slow. Let's just solo this layer. So this is just a shape layer that I've animated to create the drip. I'm just going to turn back on that proxy so that it's a little faster. So the text slides off and the drip is just a little bit delayed. You can see I've just, for one of the liquefy effects, I've just delayed the distortion a little bit. So it feels like the drip is coming from the actual letters. Bloop, like that. And I wanted to some sort of liquid to sort of fly off the letters, and I've just used, I think it was Particle World. Yeah, CC Particle World, just to have a few particles fly off. Let's just preview that again. Just like that. So liquefy, still quite a useful effect in After Effects, not one I've really done much animation with in the past. And just quickly, because this is getting pretty long, this tutorial, the last look that I created was called Ink. And here I've used some stock imagery. This is from GridKit from A Scripts, and also some stock ink footage. And I've just used that to reveal Like a Boss, just in a nice inky way, using effects like vector blur, displacement map, and some of the layer styles to give me this sort of pressed look of the text where it's sort of pressed out of the paper. And if there's some interest in this, I can break this down in a separate tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there now. If you do have any questions or you want me to expand on anything that I've shown, be sure to leave a comment. Get in there and check out Physics Now and Squash and Stretch. Definitely explore ascripts.com because there's so many useful tools there. Some of them you pay for and some of them are even free. Definitely check that out, and also check out GridKit. For now, this is John from Motionworks.net. Have fun, be creative, and I'll see you in another tutorial.